Okay, folks, let's bring this meeting to order. Thank you for taking the time to join us for this very timely discussion about Taiwan and its future. I'm very pleased to welcome Paul Huang to join us today. Let me just read out his bio quickly in case you missed it. Paul Huang is an independent journalist and research fellow at the Taiwan Public Opinion Foundation. He has contributed to research reporting and commentaries to various publications, media, and institutions on issues of politics, security, and the risk of war across the Taiwan Strait. Huang frequently appears on international media, giving expert commentary on political events unfolding in Taiwan and its surrounding region. He is currently a visiting fellow at the Fairbanks Center for Chinese Studies at Harvard University. Huang is a graduate of the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University. So we know Paul likes Boston, and now Providence too. So welcome, Paul. I think Paul will speak for 20 to 30 minutes, and there should be plenty of time for questions. And I've told him to expect a lot of great questions because that's how we do it at Watson. So thanks, Paul.
Thank you for that, and thank you everyone for coming. Really appreciate your interest in the topic. So most of you have seen the news about Taiwan had an election a couple of weeks ago. That's my main topic today, and also the implication down the road for those who missed the current Vice President Lai Ching-te of the Democratic Progressive Party, the current ruling party, won the presidential race in a three-way contest. Lai is the vice president under President Tsai Ing-wen, who has been Taiwan's president over the last 8 years. Those of you who follow Taiwan's reportings and commentary, the DPP, the Democratic Progressive Party, is usually described as the more anti-China party, whereas the opposition, the main opposition, the KMT, the Kuomintang, is usually described as a more pro-China party. But I will go into the nuance later that I think these labels are really not as meaningful as you would think. In terms of policies, there's really not that much difference. But in the legislative yuan race, so Taiwan doesn't have Taiwan is a unicameral system where there's only one parliament. The legislative yuan, the DPP lost its majority, and right now the KMT has just one seat more than the DPP. And our polls over 2023, we have for our foundation, we do opinion poll every month, and we track the state of the race over the last 1 year. And at the end of it, we found that the Lai was leading by a few percentage. And overall, we were very happy with the result of our polls. We think it was quite accurate. Some people polled after the election, some online media pulled a table comparing all the polls in Taiwan and placed our poll on the top 4, the closest to the result. But of course, I would say we were the most accurate because the first 3 they were done days after ours, much closer to the deadline which you could publish poll. So things changed during the elections, of course, especially the last 1 or 2 weeks, and that's why the closer to the race would be more accurate. But we were pretty close to the result, and we accurately predicted that Lai was favored to win, which he did. In the legislative yuan, the parliament, in the last 2 elections, 2016 and 2020, the ruling DPP won the absolute majority in the parliament, in the LY. This year, it lost that majority. The KMT, the major opposition, also did not get absolute majority, but the 8 seats were won by the third party called the Taiwan People's Party, the TPP, which is controlled by photo didn't come up. The other so that's the Ke Wen-je, that's the former Taipei mayor. He's now the undisputable third force in Taiwan's politics. He's very popular among the young people, and his party, the TPP, now controls the 8 seats in the Legislative Yuan. With his help, the KMT elected their own speaker. They built coalitions, and now they have the Legislative Yuan majority. Of course, they are, which will have implication down the road. I think that one of my predictions is because the DPP now lost that majority in the Legislative Yuan, there will be more check and balance in the parliament, in the budgeting process down the road. In my opinion, I think that's a good thing that to introduce some check and balance in that process. The other predictions I have, the Lai's personnel, his policies, his political appointees will be more or less similar to President Tsai over the last 8 years. His record in recent years and the people surrounding him gives no hint to he will have to do anything other than those. And people around him are mostly Tsai's people anyway. He has a few personnel that are more ideological than the President Tsai's, but more or less they will be doing the same thing. We're told tough in China. In terms of policies, however, that is another story. What are the lessons I can draw from this election? I think lesson number one, this election, presidential legislative election, was more about Taiwan's domestic politics rather than China. Because all the international media reportings, all these commentary in the West, you see, they always begin with, well, the China, the anti-China party won the elections, or the pro-China party was defeated. And, I'm going to tell you that these labels, these descriptive terms, have really less meaning than in Taiwan politics than you presume, because what they talk about is really not the same as what they do, and the actual differences are actually not that much. And besides, in this election, most of the discussion, most of the focus has been on domestic politics over the performance of President Tsai over the last 8 years. If you ask me, I think this was more of a referendum on the domestic governance over the last 8 years. And people were definitely not happy. Majority wanted a different government, but because it was a three-way race, and therefore Lai Ching-te, the DPP, won the presidential race with a minority share of the votes. That's just how the game works, but it still doesn't change the fact that the majority actually weren't that happy with the DPP having another 4 years. We also found that this is one from last year. This is from January. The majority were actually happy to see that we now have a divided government where the legislature is controlled by the oppositions. Now the DPP and a lot of international commentary have said, well, with this, the government will be divided, and there will be chaos, or Taiwan will be less stable, and China could somehow inject its influence, whatever. No, because this is how democracy works. You don't always get the DPP has had the total government over the last 8 years, and if they won the presidency, the legislative yuan is now controlled by the opposition. And in my opinion, that is how the process works. And in our poll, we found that's what Taiwanese people are happy with. Then lesson two, I think a lot of commentary I also saw. They think that this election is an endorsement of President Tsai's policies on China over the last 8 years. Well, yes and no, because our polls have found the majority were not satisfied with President Tsai's performance in handling cross-strait relations with China. So those of you who haven't followed development in Taiwan, China, in cross-strait relations, the relation has been very tense over the last 8 years. People usually attribute that to the fact that the DPP was in power and the Beijing, the PRC, has not been happy about that, and therefore they. But in my view, that is really not going. That is just going to be the case, regardless of who wins. Even on cross-strait relations, so I said that this election was not about that. It was more about domestic politics. But even on cross-strait relations with China, the majority were also not very happy with the things that President Tsai has been handling it. And that's not really because the majority want to go back to China, unite with China. Not that at all, because our poll, we also found that in the latest number from January, 44% of Taiwan public, they say that they prefer independence as Taiwan's political futures. Percentage of those support status quo, 33%, only about 11% support unification with China. Our poll, this is the poll we have been doing over many years. Results have been remarkably similar. Those support usually about 40 to 50% support independence, and that's the majority opinion of the Taiwan public. And that being said, keep that in mind because any elected Taiwan politician needs to keep in mind that that's the majority opinion. If they go against that, they are in risk of being voted out of power or losing elections. Picture of Xi Jinping there, but it's not showing. Xi Jinping's what he's publicly stated over many times. The Taiwan must be reunited with China at some point in the future. So he preferred that to be a peaceful reunification. But if Taiwan independent forces prevent that from happening, then force might be used. That's all that the PRC said. Right? It doesn't really give you a firm red line. Says that if you change the constitution, or if you change something, that we are definitely going to attack you. Nor do they say, if you don't do this thing, we're not going to attack you. This is, and finally, I think one lesson that we can draw. 1 day up, so 2 days after the result was out, I had the date around there. The election happened on January 13, on a Saturday night. On Monday morning, Nauru, this small island nation in the Pacific, broke off formal diplomatic relations with Taiwan. For those who don't know, Taiwan, under the former name Republic of China, has formal diplomatic relations with 12 countries who formally recognize Taiwan, the ROC, as a country, whereas the rest of the world, including the United States, recognize the PRC, the People's Republic of China, and do not have formal diplomatic relations with Taiwan. Nauru, one of the remaining ones, broke up with that relation just 2 days after after Taiwan's election. So a lot of headlines you see, wow, the China is punishing Taiwan by buying off another allies because Taiwan elected DPP. Well, I'm here to tell you that that's really not the case, because if you do some simple, if you look at the facts, it happened on January 15, on the Monday. January 14 was a Sunday. So the negotiation must have been done well before January 13. And keep in mind, because Nauru had diplomatic relations with Taiwan, with the ROC, the PRC didn't have an embassy or representative there. So whatever the deal was, it was made long before the result was out. And Nauru had proceeded to do that, even if KMT or TPP, Kernwinzer or Hoyoyi have won. It was not because of a DVP. It was just the way. So China definitely encouraged them to select this date to send a message. Well, we are going to continue doing this regardless of your internal politics. That's the message. It's not the politicians did the DVP. And also, China is going to continue to exert coercion on Taiwan, build out its military, the People's Liberation Army, modernize the PLA, which at this point is already far out past Taiwan in quality and quantitative terms. The military spending is just off the differences there are just off the chart. And that spending alone doesn't tell you the full picture because China has a complete supply chains and manufacturing over it builds most, if not all, of its military equipment and develops its own technology, whereas Taiwan purchases it from the United States. If you look at the dollar value, everything Taiwan of the same thing, similar comparable thing Taiwan is buying from the United States, China is building them for themselves at the price differences of 20x, 30x, sometimes 50x. Some items even reach 100x. So one missile that Taiwan purchased from the United States, China is probably making it 100 times cheaper than whatever Taiwan is buying. And that creates a huge problem because there's China's population is six times of Taiwan. Its economy vastly overpowered that of Taiwan, and the amount of money and resources. So this goes into the second part of my presentation, which is security implication down the road. The problem will remain regardless of who wins. And Taiwan's elected politicians, including especially the future President Lai Ching-te, they don't really have a new answer, new solutions to this. A lot of problems that we already is very well known. Lai is expert on the PLA, so some of these you can correct me more, but some of the things I see that have to be said in the Australian think tank SPI, they have a critical technology tracker. Out of the 44 critical technologies competitions between the US and China, they listed 37, that China leads in 37 out of those 44. So China today is the king of the world's manufacturing, and there's no stop, no slowdown inside. They dominate most domains of industrial manufacturing, the R&Ds of these various domains. They have a very complete and very efficient supply chains, huge domestic markets. The industrial policies, those of you who studied this might know, Made in China 2025 and other initiatives, they took this very seriously, and we are only beginning to see the fruit of their labors, this huge industrial powers coming to being, that empowers China's military expansions, modernizations, combined with the comprehensive military reform that was put in place in 2015. There's a vast amount of new equipment, new technologies, new personnel, new ways of thinking, new ways of training. A lot of these equipments, and some of the examples, the PLA Navy, they can build a frigate in something like 7 months' time, whereas it took Japan 19 months, United States more than 2 years. It's because the shipbuilding capacity, so China controls 70 to 80% of the shipbuilding capacity in the world. Today, if you build that many ships, you have that many shipyards and people, the machinists, the electricians, the operators who know how to build those things. You can build your warships cheaply, faster, and arguably better than your opponents. The United States shipbuilding industry builds no ship other than warships for the U.S. Navy and U.S. Coast Guard. It is a vastly inefficient way of doing things, and there's just no difference inside. our poll also. This doesn't show another one. It's fine. We have found Taiwan majority of Taiwanese, they were not confident with the Taiwan military. That they think that if a war breaks out between China and Taiwan, China is going to win. Most of them, over 50%. So there's the lack of confidence in Taiwan's military. It's a lot of pictures, don't show it, but it's fine.
Really?
I can do without.
Sorry about that.
Yeah, some of I have written a lot of criticism about Taiwan's military and defense policies. I think Taiwan's military, and this is not just me saying, this is if you read Chinese sources in Taiwan, that in terms of discussion among Taiwan defense insiders and people on the ground, rather than international media reportings and think tanks in D.C., which are biased, supporting the ruling government, you will find that the things are really not looking that good for Taiwan's defense and military. The Taiwan's Navy is heavily outdated. The fleet is at least 20, 10, or even 30 years older than the current PLA Navy fleets. They lay critical technologies and basic modern things that they needed to protect themselves in a modern environment. Taiwan's Air Force is also pictured, but it doesn't show. But Taiwan spends a lot of money buying fighter jets, F-16s from the U.S. They place a lot of emphasis on that, but the problem is very obvious. That China, they have a massive rocket force with ballistic missiles. So if they target the wrong way, they can easily knock out they create a few craters on the runway, and your F-16s, regardless of how good they are, regardless of how the pilots, how experienced, how good the pilots are, they're useless because they can't take off and they can't land. And with just those opening strike, that China will be able to knock out Taiwan's Air Force in the first hour. And we know they will because there is a 100% certainty China will be the one firing the first shot. There's not going to be any scenario Taiwan firing that first shot. So China controls when, where, and how, and you can bet they will use that advantage to the fullest. And so the opening salvo, that first strike, put Taiwan in a massive disadvantage. The Air Force being one of them. But the Taiwan's defense planner and policy planner, they treat it as if they don't really even consider that. Taiwan's army, I think, is the worst of all. The trainings are extremely unrealistic. I've written quite extensive about that. The trainings and doctrines and the ways that they conceive how the Chinese military are these days, they're really out of date. Picture not showing.
No, I'm sorry about that.
Yeah. Let me see if I can. Maybe I'll.
Too big a file.
Again.
Do you have a PDF of it? Well, perhaps we just proceed,
Yeah,
but
yeah,
we
we
can,
can, All right.
hopefully we can, you can send me a
So-
PDF of the slides and then I can circulate it so people can see the images
Right.
later. Something. I know how frustrating it is.
It's okay.
And these images are really important. I mean, people are unaware about what the military balance is because these images don't show up in the mainstream media.
The Taiwan, so the reserve systems is also a mess. I was co-op. I was a conscript. I served the conscription for 1 year, more than 10 years ago. So in 2022, I was co-op as a reservist for a week-long training, and I personally observed. My expectation was already low, but it was even lower than the lowest of my expectation, and I written and criticized it. And basically, it was nothing or not any element component of that training was designed or taken seriously. And this has to do with, I go back to my critique of current Taiwan's military, that we have a severe civil-military relations problems. The military, it's because Taiwan's military, even after Taiwan became a democracy, it still follow the same routines and same way of doing things. Back during the time when Taiwan was under the Kuomintang, or the one-party rule, back in the time when the purpose of the military was more as an internal control, as a prestige showing internal control rather than seriously fighting and invading opponents. Because the PRC, China as a PLA, for much of its early existence, from the 50s to the late 90s, even early 2000s, they were just not capable of launching an invasion on Taiwan. But now, in the last 20 years, everything changed. The Chinese PLA, they have changed dramatically. Going forward, what I think that must be done for Taiwan, China is not going to negotiate with Taiwan, especially now with DPP, Taiwan's Democratic Progressive Party in power. So it will continue to do things regardless of what's happening in Taiwan domestically. But what we need to do, it's like Theodore Roosevelt, he said that there's a famous words that you speak softly, you carry a big stick. The problem I see is in Taiwan over the last 8 years, especially under the DPP government, I think they have been doing the exact opposite. And that needs to be changed, because you talk tough about China, that really doesn't change the military balance, the balancing technology, economic power. It has no relation to those metrics. So talking tough wouldn't get you any safer. In fact, you can argue that it might provoke China, but that's another topic. In any case, you should focus on getting prepared, building up your own defense, and keep quiet. Basically, that would be the wise man's advice. However, Taiwan's democracy, Taiwan's electoral politics is, because as I have shown you, the Taiwan's majority public opinion, they prefer long-term independence. They also, majority don't have very good impressions of the Chinese government. The majority also, they have an aversion to China, especially among the hardcore DPP supporters. So the DPP knows this very well. They can play their card. If they talk tough on China, they can win elections. Now, of course, in this election, it didn't work out that well for them. It worked in some way because they need to consolidate their base, which they did. But it didn't help them to push over the majority line. Another thing that this was a picture that showed. It's just the news came out today. So the United States there have been sporadic reports about United States training Taiwan's military, sending special forces to Taiwan. And if you ask me, in my opinion, that's the worst place you can send. You can do training, because special forces are the most specialized. They are the rarest of your military. You are basically training small elements of that force that's not going to have a macro effect on the military as a whole. And you train these grunts, these infantry soldiers, special forces, how to do this technical maneuver. I mean, is that really going to help? And China is bombarding Taiwan with missiles and launching a comprehensive air and naval invasion? No, because these special forces, they're not going to have helicopter to parachute into enemy territory. That's just not going to happen. If anything that can be done, they should send officers to train Taiwan's officers to review Taiwan's defense planning, to review how to revise how trainings are being done, how troops are being positioned. But those are not happening because Taiwan's military internally resists any call for changes. And so they can accept the United States sending special forces to train Taiwan, these privates, but they're not going to change the way they do trainings on the top. So some of these, some other things, I think Taiwan should definitely revise its defense posture. The ADIZ, the so-called the Air Defense Identification Zone, you see a lot of news reporting, commentary about the Chinese aircraft incurs into Taiwan's airspace. Is really about ADIZ, Air Defense Identification Zone, which, by the way, has no basis in international law. The ADIZ is only relevant if you have the power to enforce it. In this case, Taiwan's Air Force, the Chinese PLA Air Force continues to do this because they can, because they have vastly modernized, expand its Air Force. It is able to put that amount of pressures, that amount of activities onto Taiwan, which Taiwan can no longer afford to intercept, to every one of these flights. And this put a tremendous pressure on Taiwan's Air Force. And Taiwan's politicians still talk as if these are invasion, which they are not. They need to be serious, they need to be realistic, redraw our defense parameter back to what is internationally, legally allowed, which is territorial seas and the sovereign airspace. It will be drastically smaller, which is this little ring down here, but defend what needs to be absolutely needs to be defended, rather than continue on to this unrealistic claim. Another thing that you might notice, the Taiwan's ADIZ actually extend into China, into Fujian. It was drawn in the Cold War, but that just tells you how unrealistic it is. I think United States selling more weapons, so gifting more weapons to Taiwan will not fix Taiwan's problem. In fact, it might even make things worse because hardware equipments are the last thing that's relevant to a military's overall warfighting capability. I think it's the training, it's the people, it's the way of the strategy and tactics that matter. It's those things that the United States should help Taiwan. Should well, not force, but urge Taiwan to reconsider how it does these things, rather than giving more munitions, weapons, fighter jets, which we know that could be easily destroyed by China in the beginning of the war. That's all. So that's all I have. I apologize for the picture not showing, but I look forward to your questions.
Okay, wonderful, Paul. Really outstanding. Yeah, you can see why I invited Paul Huang to come down here. He's a truly amazing expert with a lot of interesting and unique views, really from the inside in many respects. Well, we have about a half an hour. We have to end a bit before 1. I and many of us have to get to class. But let me pitch the first question, but I hope others will also pitch many questions. You've heard this question from me before, but I think your answer is so interesting, I'd like to share it with the group. In the United States, we're talking a lot about possible amphibious invasion of Taiwan by China. We're also, a lot of people, though, think that's less likely, and a blockade is the most likely scenario. But you are considering other scenarios, too, that you maybe consider most likely.
Well, if I'm China, if I if you assume they are rational, if they start this fight, would you prefer this to be a long fight or a short fight? Of course, you want to end it as soon as possible. You have your goal, which is to force Taiwan to capitulate, to surrender. Preferably as early as short as possible. Preferably keep the casualties as low as possible, especially to civilian as low as possible, because you want to grab Taiwan as a whole. You don't want to destroy it and have just get a piece of ruin, right? So amphibious invasion is the opposite of all these. You are talking about actually landing troops and then fight a ground war on Taiwan. That's really the last thing that they wanted. So could they force Taiwan to capitulate without landing troops on Taiwan? Of course, they could. An overwhelming air, naval, missiles attack on Taiwan in a relatively very short time frame, destroy Taiwan's military's the most high-profile assets and platforms, inflict huge humiliations on Taiwan's political leaderships, and create chaos because they can destroy command and controls and even knock out Taiwan's leaderships, and that's how they get the result they wanted. Now, a blockade scenario is interesting, but I also don't think that it is in their interest, because you need to. A blockade meaning that you block off the sea line of communication, but it doesn't necessarily mean you will attack within Taiwan. So this is basically giving Taiwan time for Taiwan and the United States and everyone else to mobilize, to consult, to come to Taiwan's defense. This is also not what China wanted. It wants that strike to be that first strike, that attack to be to a high tempo, fast, decisive, preferably ending in a few days. And Taiwan surrender. That's the best scenario. Blockade will take too much longer, and you will have so much negative effect on, because once you start the blockade, it will also disrupt shipments to Shanghai, to Tianjin, to the key ports in China. The economy will go into chaos. That's also the things that they don't want. They want to win this war without disrupting the rest of China. The quick victory is what they wanted. That this is, of course, if you assume they are rational, which I think you should assume that. I mean, you could assume, well, Xi Jinping is not rational, so he would just create chaos and start shooting, attacking Taiwan's outer island for no reason, and doing blockade here and there. But you should assume your enemy is rational to begin with.
Great. Well, I got another dozen questions, but I think let's hear from the audience. Sir, go ahead.
I have two related questions. One is, in Europe, it's a military attack to achieve unification inevitable. Do you think it is? And number two, whether that's the common sentiment of the opinion in Taiwan, instead of Taiwan.
I think that if you look at Taiwan's public opinion trends, so we have found, the latest being in January, 44% support, prefer independence over the long run. Percentage of supporting status quo increased a little bit in January, but still, you can see the majority were not, only like 10% wanted unification. So if you were China, if you understand Taiwan, how Taiwan works, the elections, the politics works, you know, they're never going to elect someone that's handed on the plate to you. So you have to prepare to get it the other way. If they have thought this through, right? If that's their goal, if that's what they want to achieve, that's what they have been preparing to do. The build up, the PLA, the exercise, the planning, the thinking, putting efforts, putting to that, has been preparing for this. And I think, nothing is inevitable until it happens. with the way that things are going, I think that as the balance continue to go off off the charts, there comes a point when the risk for China becomes is limited to an extent which Xi Jinping or the Central Military Commission might say, okay, we've done calculation, we've done wargaming, whatever, we think we can do it. We can contain the risk to our own, to China, to our own regimes, and we have a very high probability of getting Taiwan, winning this war very quick, very decisive. That's when they will do it. If things don't change, if Taiwan doesn't fix its own defense and military posture.
Bill?
Population? 23.5 million.
So not trying to make a joke, but for mathematics one, the China can conquer Taiwan just by scattering the tourists without people. We just overwhelming, number-wise. But it's not mathematics.
But
Taiwan. You don't even use that.
well, the Chinese tourists. So after COVID, they stopped tourists from coming in. Yeah. I think, yeah, I think what's relevant in the population discussion is there's a lot of talk about China's aging populations and dwindling the newborn births and stuff, but it's even worse in Taiwan. And because Taiwan, we are 1/60th of China's population, is the first, and that's going to impact Taiwan's military. Because you will no longer find enough recruits, either volunteers or conscripts. If your base number of male turning of age is like 50,000, that's all you can get as a soldier. You can't get 100% of the male, young male to go to the military. It's just not going to happen. You can maybe at most 10 to 20%. It would be amazing. That's like what? 20,000 people? And they're going to leave after 1 year. Taiwan's current force size is 150,000. How are you going to go? And it's already low. It's already very low. It's historically low. It's not enough. So how are you going to how is Taiwan's population going to sustain their force size without a drastic political commitment, changing the conscription to maybe 3 years, or maybe have a massive investment and complete redesign of Taiwan's military system.
Okay, let's get some more questions. Yeah, James.
With the Chinese equity market tanking so heavily in the last 6 months, alongside their sovereign debt rising so quickly in the last recent years, do you anticipate the Chinese economic performance playing a crucial role in whether or not they invade Taiwan, and how do you foresee that playing out? Like, would you say they're in too much of an unstable economic position right now to potentially invade in coming years, or would you say that is not a contributing factor?
Well, in Taiwan, it's very popular. The government has been saying that the people associated with the government have been keep saying, oh, the Chinese the internal economic situations and everything is so weak and so whatever, and so they can't attack Taiwan. Well, I mean, in fact, just years ago they were saying the opposite. They were saying that if China has economic troubles or internal troubles, they will attack Taiwan as a diversion. So I think this is just all conjectures. This is not how Xi Jinping, Beijing actually makes its decision on Taiwan. And because when they think about Taiwan, they're not thinking about China, the Shanghai's stock index. They're thinking about the grand design for reunifications and how they can achieve that goal, right? So it's another level compared to, say, stock market or problem in real estate. I just don't think that they would put that in their consideration.
Yeah, okay. Matthias, yeah.
A quick question on the public opinion on the other side of the strait.
Yeah.
In your reading, how much is the Chinese population willing to sacrifice to unify with Taiwan?
Well, they,
As far as I can tell, people would like Taiwan to be part of China, but they would not be willing to make a large personal sacrifice, certainly not go to war and risk their life. And does that not add a lot of pressure from the Chinese leadership not to do anything military?
Yeah, can I add on to that too? It's about, a lot of this, as you suggest, is about, it's not so much about weapons, it's about people and what motivates them. And you talked about, possible morale issues in the Taiwan forces, but what about the PLA? Can you comment on that as well? It's a related point.
well, so one, I think that a lot of these about opinion pollings about general populations well to fight, I think they're really not very useful because you're polling general populations when the percentage of people who's actually going to fight, who's in the military or of military age, or those who might be in any position to be on the battlefield to contribute to the war effort, they're very, very low, something like 2%, 3% top in both Taiwan and China's case. In China's case, it's probably like 1%, 0.5%. So it's even lower than your polling your margin of error. So you're not going to it's likely you're not going to ask more than if you do a poll of 1,000 people, probably not even more than the 2 or 3 people that would be in the PLA or have any place in the PLA. So you're not actually asking the right samples. And besides, it's also not the question to ask, because in the military, if you are a soldier, it is your duty to fight. You follow orders. You don't say, well, this government is sending me to Afghanistan. I don't want to fight in Afghanistan, so I'm just going to leave, right? This is not how it works. It's you signed out that contract, or you are conscripted and you follow order, whatever that is. Second, I think the opinion polling in China is always needs to be very careful in interpreting any of such result. I've seen some people do done that. They publish papers about it, done an opinion polling in China, asking if they would support a war with Taiwan, something like that. But if you see the methodologies of those polls, I've seen one paper that was being shared widely. You look at they use an online poll. So as a pollster, I can tell you that if you see any polls they use online, web polls or email polls or anything that is not a randomly selected, not a sample, you can pretty much discard those polls as methodologically problematic. Online polls are just not accurate. They're just not useful. They don't give you any sense of the general population.
Yes, sir. Yes. A little louder, if you don't mind.
Historically, before Ukraine war, the percentage of Taiwanese who said they think the United States will come to Taiwan's defense was very high, something like 60%. After the Ukraine war, it reverted. The percentage of those who have confidence in U.S. intervention was down to 30-something%, and the people who didn't believe will say, no, the United States will not come up to 70%. And it completely changed that. So it was the Ukraine war that changed the perception. Because they saw the United States didn't intervene in Ukraine, didn't directly, and so 20 is a huge shift. About 30% people, they saw that and they say, wow, the United States is probably not going to help if Taiwan is attacked by China. But after Ukraine, over the course of last 1 year, especially because President Biden made those comments about, I'm definitely going. The United States definitely going to intervene, and also Nancy Pelosi's visits, combined with Taiwan's the DPP government, they have over many years they have made this a major point of their propaganda. They want to assure Taiwan public that the United States is definitely going to intervene. So it recovered somehow in over 2022 and 2023. The last one we done back in, I think, was summer last year. It was it's about 50% no confident, 40% confident. So it's almost down to even. But next one we don't know. But we can say that the majority of Taiwanese they observe what the United States do. Then they don't have, and they look at the U.S. with a skeptical eyes, regardless of what the government told them otherwise.
Yes.
Going back to the recent election, and specifically the international relations, the nuances of that with Nauru. Given that you said you believe like that decision was made well in advance of the actual results of the election, why do you believe the kind of formal announcement was made after the election on the, January 15th, and what are kind of what are the significances of that?
Either that China encouraged Nauru to make that the announcement day, or Nauru just by itself decided that they're going to pick this day as kind of like a gift to China. I know, okay, well, we try to appease you. We're helping send a message to Taiwan. I think the former is more likely. That China they have done this negotiation. They have worked out. Well, they're going to give you 100 million aid or something, and China and Nauru asked, well, what would you want us to do? And China, the Chinese diplomats said, okay, well, January 15th after the elections, just send Taiwan a message, right?
So do you think then that it was related in some way to the DPP?
Related to the election, but not the DPP, because even if the KMT or even if Hou Yu-ih or Ko Wen-je had won, it was still proceeded. And it's, if you know how diplomatic negotiations are done, this is very logical, because there's no circumstances that Nauru will agree to Chinese some kind of Chinese deal, say, well, if the DPP somehow lose, then we are not going to proceed, right? Now, because Nauru wanted that 100 million, so that deal was already reached, right? You can't just say, Nauru can't just agree, say, well, if Taiwan something, we don't care about Taiwan, we care about that 100 million. So this would have proceeded regardless of what the result was.
Okay, folks, we got about 5 more minutes, so I propose, we do kind of a speed round of questions, and then we'll give Paul the last 3 or 4 minutes to get around to them as much as he can. So I'll put one more on the table and say there was a front-page New York Times article about China's nuclear buildup, and that article really linked it to a Taiwan scenario. So I just wonder how you think that, is that your assessment also? Okay, a few more last questions as we go, yes, and then we'll go over here.
Yes. Quick question. The 10 seats that are particularly DPP and 8 seats plus the 2 independent, do you see that as a significant, impact on the overall parliamentary dynamics? Are they going to align more closely with DPP or the KMT side, or is it going to be, a little bit more disparate there?
Okay. Okay, yeah.
Could you say again?
Okay, great. Yeah, Sean? Yeah, we'll get both of those. Speed round. Go ahead. Go ahead, John. Yeah.
I've seen reports that the U.S. is quickly investing in mass production of drone technologies to kind of mitigate against China. Do you see that as a realistic or effective solution to this problem? And what it means for your factories? And what are your thoughts on that?
Yes?
Given that the DPP is not popular, but still won the last election, is there any change? Is there any movement in Taiwan to change the first past the post presidential system to reflect that, or somehow change how they elect the parliament?
Okay, great questions, as expected. Well, James, you already pitched a question. All right, let's Paul,
Well, the nuclear.
speed
Yes,
questions
well,
and speed answers.
The nuclear weapon part, I'm not an expert on that. I really don't have much to say, but I do believe that the Dongfeng 26, there's been a discussion about. So the Dongfeng 26 is an anti-ship ballistic missile. It can be used as an anti-ship ballistic missile, so to attack U.S. aircraft carrier and other surface warships. There's a talk about. So we saw that usually we assume that will be a conventional warhead. So high explosive, but of course the Dongfeng 26 it could also be loaded with nuclear warhead. Now there's a lot of talk about if that's the case, then if China, if United States intervene and then preempted and conduct preemptive strikes or an attack on these Dongfeng missile units. If the China might perceive it as an attack on its strategic force, and I think this is an interesting question, whether this would deter the United States from doing so, because they were saying that China would see it as an attack on nuclear force and could start a nuclear war. But I'm not an expert on that, and I would just leave that to other. Sorry, could you quickly
The
say
legislative
again?
yuan.
Right. Well, so the legislative yuan of Taiwan it has considerably less power as a parliament compared to the U.S. Congress, because it doesn't have power over the appointments of the officials. It only has budgetary power, and even that is very weak. That's also one of my criticisms of Taiwan's defense plannings and the defense budgeting. There's not enough audit and check and balance and due diligence being done. But with the DPP losing the majority, I think that there will finally be more questions asked about what's being done. The TPP, they have reached an agreement with the KMT, so they elected Han Kuo-yu as the speaker. So now they form a sort of a coalition within the parliament. Now, of course, that is fluid. So the TPP, the Ko Wen-je, and he has a reputation for being unpredictable. So maybe a few months down the road, he will decide, well, the KMT is not the best I can work with. I'll just work with TPP. So who knows? But from his perspective, I think the Ko will be better served working with the KMT, just because the DPP is not going to give TPP any benefit.
How about this other question on the domestic politics, this first past the post, electoral reform, is that?
Well, I don't think it's going to change. It's just not how Taiwan's it works. Because if it changes, then they would be given. Then we will be moving into more of a Westminster system or something like that. But in Taiwan, is none of these major parties have an incentive to change that. Even in Ko Wen, so Ko Wen-je, I think he's going to try again in 2028. So it probably is still going to be a three-way race if that's the case. But I haven't seen any talk about changing that, how the presidential election is being done. So Taiwan is a semi-presidential system. The president is extremely powerful, even more powerful than the U.S. president in the U.S. system. So basically, the winner basically takes all. That is also a disadvantage of Taiwan system, but I don't see any discussion about that being changed.
Okay.
Remind me,
And then the last two questions were one about the readjustment of the ADIS because that could be signal
Yes.
weakness. And then the final question was about the U.S. DoD using drones heavily to cope with a lot of these issues.
So the air defense identification zone, it has no basis in international law. It's really only relevant if you have the power to enforce it. It's basically like drawing a piece of territory, saying, this is my turf. Now, if you are the toughest kid on the block, you can do it. But if there's another kid that's stronger than you, well, then you are just asking for trouble, right? You're just like, you're basically provoking a fight with that. Especially if you draw into his territory, you draw into his, what is actually like rightfully his. It's just not going to happen. And so if you can't enforce it, all you can do is to go on international media and cry out loud, well, China enter our ADIZ again. Okay, well, what is international community going to do for you? Because this is not even your legal claim. This is not in any international law. It says you can draw onto China's, you draw your ADIZ over China's airspace, right? To be realistic, I think Taiwan should consider and withdraw that. The asymmetric part, I'm not sure the specifics, which the component you're talking about, but in Taiwan context, there's a lot of discussion about this asymmetric versus conventional debate. I'm more into the asymmetric side, but that doesn't mean that I agree with everything that a lot of these U.S. pundits have been saying. So the criticism has been those who are willing to criticize Taiwan. They usually go along this line that Taiwan should buy more asymmetric weapons. Taiwan should stop buying conventional weapons. I think Taiwan should stop buying these conventional weapons, but not because asymmetric weapons are more effective. All weapons are basically the same. It's just whether those can be of use to you. So those sea mines, those missiles, it might sound like asymmetric to you, but in practice, they basically function pretty. In tactical strategic term, it's the same. It's the same dynamics. And there's really no magic weapon. Say you buy this and then you can fix everything. Right? You buy 100,000 drones, and 100,000 drones going to help you overcome China's air force. No, because drones, say if you buy 100,000 small drones, all that China needs to do is to turn on electronic warfare, and then the signals are jammed, and all your tens of thousands of drones just fall from the sky. So because you don't have enough relay communications, that signal power to command control those drones. So there's no magic fix to the problem.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no magic fix. Paul Huang, thank you very much for joining us today. Outstanding job, and I hope you will come back soon and help us understand this some more. But please join me in thanking Paul Huang.